In many cases, for all intents and purposes, a block wall or a cast-in-place concrete wall are interchangeable structures. I mean, they're resisting rot, they're providing strength, they're providing security. They can be treated so that they become a waterproof barrier. They behave and provide a very similar contribution to almost any structure. What this doesn't mean is that necessarily an 8-inch block wall is interchangeable with an 8-inch concrete wall. Now, they can be, depending on rebar and footing size and the use that you're putting them to and where you're located and the weather and whether it's above ground or below ground. So they can be one-to-one, apples to apples, or they can be, just about as clearly as anything you want to mention, apples to oranges. And so this is why it's a good idea not to assume that just because you're comfortable with one, that is the solution to every problem you might encounter in construction. I'm going to talk through some of the differences, as I understand them, between the two methods, particularly as it applies to this job, because we've used both processes, both materials, in similar situations, but with different outcomes on the site that I'm sitting on. This is an example of a cast-in-place concrete wall that I poured about a month ago. Behind me, there's a similar wall, taller, that I poured 2 years ago. And on the other end of this site, I've got a wall that I poured about the same time as this wall, only it's 8 feet high. And all three of these walls, functioning as one retaining wall system, are busy holding back the dirt and making a place for the water to collect and get put into a drain and go out to the street. They're retaining walls. And I did a little bit of work to make sure they were a little more attractive and some reveal strips, and they sort of illustrate that concrete can be used in the toughest situations, but you have to take a little trouble to make concrete anything other than concrete. But there are a wide range of things that you can do to make it more attractive, like an incredibly wide range. One of the characteristics of pouring a concrete wall is it's a risky, or it's an exciting process, because when it's showtime, when the concrete is going into the forms, there's all sorts of things that can cause real trouble all at once. And once that pouring action starts, you can't interrupt it until that pour sequence is done. This is different than block in several ways. Block can also be very strong. It can also be very resilient. It can be somewhat dynamic, and you can control the cracking, and it can retain dirt, and it can be made waterproof. But it happens incrementally. It happens one block at a time. So the act of making the wall is less stressful. There's less pressure. There's less urgency about the cleanup and the scheduling and the sequencing of materials, because it's not going up any faster than the masons, or perhaps you're going to try it, can make it happen with their 2 hands and their trowel and mixing the mud. It's an incremental process. Sometimes that's a relief. It's fascinating to me. There's an element of romance and nostalgia around the fact that laying block or brick, masonry, is essentially unchanged. I mean, in its fundamental characteristics, it's unchanged for hundreds of years. Now CMU is a relatively recent adaptation, but bricks have been being made since the Israelites were making, mud bricks along the Nile. Egyptians were making blocks and bricks a long time ago, and many other cultures were also. And the tools that were used to put those masonry units together then are very similar to the tools that are used to put them together now. Anybody can afford to buy those tools. Doesn't take a lot of room to store them. You can get them all to the job in the back of your car, sort of, and with practice anybody can use them. Way different with concrete, particularly with wall form systems. Before you even begin to think about the concrete itself, you have to have an entire framer's toolkit in your truck to build the forms to hold the concrete. You're going to encounter all kinds of situations where you have to manipulate wood or form systems in order to hold the concrete securely, perfectly securely. And then, if you're going to use a wall form system like I did, you have to either buy or already have or rent or borrow that form system, and you have to haul it. And so understanding that the molds are a very technical process, we haven't even touched on the concrete tools themselves. There are oil sprayers, there are concrete pumps, there are vibrators, there are just an infinite variety of trowels and floats and screeds and derbies and whip trowel. There's just all kinds of stuff. And the more you have, the more prepared you are for unforeseen moments that come up with concrete, because that is one of the big differences between a concrete wall and a CMU wall, that a concrete wall is going to have all sorts of unforeseen and stress-laden decisions to be made in the moment. There's a lot of variables with a concrete wall. I would like to be able to tell you definitively which one is more expensive and which one is less expensive, which one is a bargain and which one is a Cadillac solution. But I can't, because every application is different. Every wall is a different height, every wall requires a different amount of strength, every wall or every building is more or less complicated or choppy, corners and curves and heights. Every job has a different appearance requirement. And so with all of those variables, with either material being an option, each particular job's set of challenges is going to make one material or the other more or less expensive. For instance, a wall around your yard that's got to be 8 feet high but doesn't have to be very strong. It only has to resist wind load, and it's not holding anything up, so it doesn't have to be solid grouted. Probably block. Certainly block. But a stem wall like we've put on this project, it's all in the 2.5 to 4.5 foot high range. It's relatively straight, there's a few corners. It probably is a wash on cost. If I was going to sub out the concrete or sub out the block, the block may have been a little less, even though it's solid grouted. Now it might be different in your area. You might have a lot of block masons, or you might have a lot of concrete guys, and so that dynamic of lots of guys in the market will push one cost down or the other cost down, and you'll have to figure that out for yourself. But in any case, I don't think there'd be more than 10 or 15% difference in the cost, almost regardless of where you're at. Maybe, at least that's how it's at around here. On this project, we chose block on the stem wall. Probably 3 reasons. And the first was, I'm 61, and I am tired of lugging Simon's forms around and casting walls in place. I've done a lot of it on this site over the last couple of years, and frankly, I've had enough of that. The second reason is that for the last, 2 years that Nate and I have been designing this house, it's been obvious to me that I love the way a split-face block looks underneath and holding up a house. It just looks organic. It looks like this wonderful hybrid between Mother Nature and manufacturing. It looks strong, it looks organic, I like it. And so I wanted to have a block stem wall presenting on the downhill and street sides of the house. And the third reason was time. These guys had this wall done in 3 days. It was all done. 3 days, and then a day later I grouted it, and it was finished. It was in place, it was done, and my back didn't hurt, and it was time, to move on. Balancing all three of these things, the cost, the appearance, and how long it's going to take, for me, under this house, a block stem wall made lots of sense. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. There's always examples of the best you've ever seen and the worst you've ever seen. And in terms of masonry walls, this one hits somewhere in the middle. It is neither the best nor the worst, and no masonry wall looks that great under a blazing summer sun, showing off the shadow lines and the ledges. But I'll tell you this, given the reality that everything in construction has to measure up to 3 criteria: how good it is, how much it costs, and how long it takes, and that 2 out of 3 is the best you're ever going to get. Mike and Steve got in here in a hurry. They got it done in a hurry, and they got it done at a fair price. That's 2 out of 3. And I am perfectly contented to take that, and I just appreciate that those guys came over here and made this happen, and it looks great driving up the street, and it's going to make a nice contribution to this project. Regardless of whether you're talking block wall or concrete wall, there's one player who has the vital role in the outcome for both systems, and that is your batch plant. Because your block wall is going to be grouted, and your concrete wall is full of concrete. So whoever it is that's making that cementitious material, that concrete, has absolute control over the strength of your product, and in many cases the appearance of your product. The block fill in this block wall that you're probably looking at right now was a pretty sophisticated mix design, primarily because of the admixtures. It started out as low slump, a nice tight 3 to 4 inch block fill slump, which is nowhere near loose enough to fill all the voids, and then was brought up to an 8 or a 9 with super plasticizer. And then the set was retarded with Delvo. And all of these things came in consultation with Duke, the dispatch man, on the phone. Duke, here's what I'm doing. What do you recommend? We've done this before, that other job I did. And so we just zeroed in. Those guys always have their head in the game. I've never been disappointed with a load of mud that came from Umpqua sand and gravel. So to wrap this up and sort of give you your marching orders on which one you ought to use, talk to some pros. Find somebody with experience, ask them what they would use in this situation, and right away you're going to find out what it is about where you live that makes one choice or the other the way to go. Thanks for watching Essential Craftsman, and keep up the good work.